Hello.
Hey, Tom, can you hear me?
Yeah, how's it going?
It's going, man. How are you doing?
Good. Let me see if I can get my ear pods to work.
Okay.
Um, if not, I'll just.
Technology, huh?
Yes. You would think we've done a bunch of these that I would have it.
Yeah.
Yeah, but no. All right, so that's working. Where is the? I'll probably hold on. Let me just check if I can do this in preferences really quickly.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Did that work?
Hey, you're fine.
Talk to me. Yeah, great. Awesome. Great. Cool.
Tom,
Hey, man.
I appreciate you doing this for me, dude. It's an absolute honor to have you guys on. Have you on? We tried to get
Thank you.
we tried to get Beanstalk on, but it's cool just to have you on, man. It's really an honor to have you on the show.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you so much.
So
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's going to be fun.
I want to real quick tell you kind of how I know you and how the book I want to talk about today, Nothing But a Good Time. And so one of my heroes, and the reason I do this podcast is Chris Jericho, one of my all-time favorites.
Okay.
And you guys were on his show. And I was like, okay, cool.
Right,
I love heavy metal. I love classic rock. I love that stuff. And so I was like, I'm going to listen and I may wind up reading the book. Well, I didn't get a chance to read it, but I got a chance to listen to the Audible audiobook on it. And man,
Oh, cool.
let me tell you, this is one of the best, and I'm going to say a definitive biography, because that's kind of in retrospect what it is. It's a definitive biography of metal and heavy metal and hair metal, whatever you want to call it, all put into one. And it's one of the best ones that I've read in a really, really long time. And I really mean that.
Thank
I'm not just
you
saying
so
that.
much. I appreciate
And I'm not just saying that because you're on here. That's absolute truth.
Right.
So
That's cool. That's amazing.
So the book that we're going to talk about today mostly is Nothing But a Good Time, the Uncensored History of the 80s Hard Rock Explosion. And so first question would be, how did this book come about to be? Because I think you mentioned that it took like 4 or 5 years to just write.
Yeah, I mean, it took a really long time. Basically, it's been Rich. I'm about 5 years older than Rich Beanstalk, my Richard. I call him Rich. He's called Richard in official publishing circles. But if you hear me talking about Rich, I mean Richard Beanstalk, my co-author. So I'm about 5 years older than him, and I've known him since like 1996 or something, when I was the managing editor of Guitar World magazine, and I just started there. I was probably like 25 years old or something, and he came in as an intern at the magazine, and so I've seriously known him for like 20 more than 20 years, 25 years. And the whole time, and I think the first thing I ever said to him was, "Hey man, do you smoke weed?" Because he didn't answer something about. But then once we got to know each other, he and I would always talk about this kind of music, like and you got to remember that when in 1995, 1996, I see this Nirvana album cover behind you, but that was what was happening at the time. So like, we weren't getting to write about the bands that we had grown up with. You didn't get to write about White Lion or Poison or any of that stuff, because that stuff was not cool at the time. So me and Rich would have like these little side discussions about it, and we worked together on and off for like 20 years after that. Sometimes at the same company, sometimes not, and we'd always talk about this music and like get really involved. Like it would be like, we always are, like, it was before podcasts, but we would basically be having like a 2-man podcast discussion about like Warrant or which Warrant record was better or what, this, that, the other thing. And I would say the first mention of that we should do this book was about 10 years ago. Like we were like, we should do a book on this one day. And then about 4 years ago, 5 years ago now, we just like somehow knew that it was time to do it. Like we could kind of feel that if we didn't get started, somebody was going to beat us to the punch. And I don't think either of us, we had so much passion for this topic that I don't think we would both have been so disappointed in ourselves if we had started this and then another book had come out on the subject. So that's how it was really a whole lifetime of talking about this stuff. And then once we started the process of interviewing people and getting a book deal and all that stuff, it took like 4 years from the day we decided to say like, we're doing this, because we interviewed like 200 people. And oddly, even though the book ended up selling really well and becoming like a New York Times bestseller, which is completely insane to me, nobody actually, when we were looking for a book deal, we were having a lot of trouble. So that took a while too. I have to give full kudos to our editor, Mark Resnick, who really believed in it, because he's a kid who grew up on Long Island listening to Twisted Sister, so he understood the value of it. But yeah, it was a really long haul, but that was it. It was really born of passion. Like I still get in my car and I turn on Hair Nation on Sirius XM. Like this is my music.
I wonder when you're doing this, because it took me a while doing this podcast to get someone like you on here, which, and I mean that as in 2 years ago, you would have been out of the realm because you're with this big book publisher and you're a New York Times bestseller. So it kind of would have, and I wonder if this is the same for you, and I'll get to that in just a second here. But what I mean is, it took me to get the smallest people to get some of the bigger guys on. Was that kind of how it was writing the book, where you're like, we want to end up getting Paul Stanley and Gene Simmons for the book, but we're going to have to deal with probably a manager or someone that was there behind the scenes before, someone else bigger jumps on board?
There was some of that, luckily, and definitely, especially with the higher level people, you're always contending with who else has done it.
Sure.
Who else have you interviewed for the book? And that's just the way, I'm sure that's the way it is with like when actors are signing on for movies. They're like, who else signed on for this? We had the advantage that Richard, my co-author, is still very, very active as a freelance writer. So he's writing for Guitar World magazine all the time, and he writes for Variety and the Wall Street Journal. So he's in the mix all the time still. And I, about 2000 to 2010, I started this magazine, Revolver, like the heavy metal magazine. And I was the editor in chief of that for like 10 years. So I had a lot of relationships from that. And so, and I think that during my time as an editor, I treated everybody pretty fairly and I was a good hang and stuff. So I was able to make phone calls to people and they would take my calls. Like the guy who manages, well, he just retired, but the company that manages Sebastian Bach also manages Slayer. So I knew them, and so there were a lot of people where I could make a phone call or send an email and at least it would get looked at. And the same with the publicists. I had worked with all of them because, it's always the same 10 people you're trying to, so that made it easier because I could get the email read, you know what I mean? Or I could send a text to somebody.
Right.
But having said that, when you're going for the people in Poison or, some of the bigger bands, they do, that's a process. That's a process of saying like, well, we've already done all of these people. And certainly when you're sending the emails out, you're putting in this list, here's who we've already talked to. because the guys, nobody wants to be the first one in. You know, nobody wants to be like, oh, I talked to this guy, he was crazy. Like if they see that you've talked to 15 people or two at one point it was like we've talked to 100 people, that made it a lot easier. And then there were people that we just didn't ever get. You know, like there's people you try and get forever and you never do.
Who were some of those people,
an element,
if you don't mind me asking, who were some of those people that you were like, we have to have for this book, but they were just like, you know, I don't want to do it, or the timing just didn't work?
Let's see, who turned us. Well, we knew, for example, we didn't expect to get him. We would have loved to get him, but that Jon Bon Jovi wouldn't do an interview with us. Like, and he sort of, you know, it's funny because he comes off incredibly favorably in this book. Like every band that opened for Bon Jovi during the 80s who we interview for this book are just like, they were the best. They gave us all of the stage, you know, we needed, all of the lights we needed, all of the PA we needed. They would come by and see if we needed anything. They were awesome. I think that Jon Bon Jovi sort of has transcended this era. You know, he's like a full-on celebrity person now, and he makes wine, and I think he sort of sees himself in like the Bruce Springsteen Bono league, and I don't think he wants to revisit this era. So we put in a request, but we didn't really think we would ever get him. You know, and we kept trying to think about Gene Simmons. Actually, I see the Kiss thing behind you. We asked him to do it, and he goes, you know, you're only as good as the company you keep, so I respectfully decline. So there are a couple of people like that we didn't, you know, that we didn't end up getting. Some of them because, and one of the reasons with this book that we didn't end up getting people, it wasn't even the stature of the book. It was that some artists aren't comfortable being lumped in with the quote unquote glam metal, you know, hair metal thing. So that they would rather not be in a book about this.
Sure.
And so there was some of that, you know, so there were some walls. I think we worked around it real well. And, you know, really when we had to, and it didn't happen that much, but look, there's a lot of podcasts out there. There's a lot of other material that you can draw on if you need to. So we were able to shimmy our way around it when we needed to and find, you know, archival material and just do research.
You know, what surprised me the most about this, not the book, but just in history in general, because I was born in the late 90s. You know, I'm not but 23 years old. So
right.
I didn't live this stuff, but I'm going
You're 23?
back. I'm 23. I'm
You're
going back,
man.
and I'm living this history just within the music and the documentaries and the podcast and the books. And what I found very interesting was that for a time, Van Halen, they were the band to be. Like, they were like, we have to be like Van Halen because they're doing something so different that we didn't see. And I don't think, because I know I didn't realize that, because I don't think Van Halen has a big spot in my heart. But for a lot of the people in the 80s that were trying to be something, they were like, we have to be like Van Halen.
Absolutely. I mean, I think Van Halen was the sort of like the template for this music. This was, you know, you're gonna have the hotshot guitar player, the blonde singer, and more importantly to me, songs about having a good time. Like, they're not, Van Halen is the first band where the songs are a little bit funny and they're cheeky and they're about girls, and it's not heavy metal about like wizards and demons and stuff, you know. Right. And I think that that's a really important shift. But you know, the weird thing about Van Halen that we discovered, we didn't really understand this before we started talking to people for the book, is that, you know, when they get signed out of LA, like in 76 or whatever it is, a lot of the other guys that you end up knowing from this scene, like George Lynch from Dokken and the guys from Twisted Sister and Dana Strum, even from Slaughter, they're already all there. Like, they're hanging around LA and they're in bands, and they all thought that like right after Van Halen got signed and was successful, and you know, that they were all going to get signed immediately. They're like, well, why wouldn't the labels want more Van Halens?
Right.
And none of them do get signed, because actually Van Halen is like this outlier, when really the record labels at the time were much more interested in signing punk bands and new wave bands, and the next Elvis Costello or the next Clash, or the Knack and stuff like that. So these bands thought like, all right, Van Halen made it out of here, we're next, and then they actually had to wait another 5 years. But definitely that Van Halen created the formula. Like that's, you got to have the amazing guitar player, you got to have the acrobatic singer, and especially if you were in LA at the time, they were absolutely the band to beat. And Eddie, was not the guitar player to beat, because most people couldn't beat him, but he was like sort of completely turned the whole world on its head.
Right. What? Yeah.
Go ahead.
One of my favorite parts of the book in general is the title of the chapters. They are hilarious. Like the first chapter is, I got it pulled up right here. It's the pussy plucking posse pocket of Hollywood. And I was like, I wonder exactly what this chapter is going to be about. And it was kind of exactly straightforward. Right. And I enjoyed those title because it's cool when you take something someone says and you turn it into a chapter, and it makes people think, huh, what's this about? And then you hear like whoever said that was like the pussy fucking, and I was like, I get it. And I really
Michael
Michael
Anthony, I think, from
Michael
Van Halen.
Anthony. Yeah. I kind of want to jump around a bit, and I want to share some stories here, because I know we don't have a lot of time. But so what was kind of very interesting to me was the 80s were this big, fuck you type of vibe. We're gonna rock. We're gonna headbang, and then Nirvana comes in and shuts all of that down. And they're like, you know what? That's not. And then it wasn't they were doing it intentionally. I don't think it was just this new wave came in, and it was like, okay, now we have to change over to Nirvana because look at what they're doing now. And I think that hurt a lot of bands that were in the 80s, because a lot of them, they weren't going to progress over to what Nirvana was doing. They were going to stick with what they knew.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this, and it wasn't just, I don't think it was just Nirvana. I think, and we discussed this a lot in the book, but also Rich and I have had conversations about this when we were writing the book, like what really happened. And I think Nirvana, it's a very, look, there's no doubting the impact that had. It's funny though that, I think this music, it really had already had a very good run in the spotlight. Like it had a decade of being sort of like the dominant form of rock, or 8 years. So that's a pretty good run. And by the end of, by the early 90s, the bands themselves even admitted they weren't doing their best work. They like all of the, and they were kind of damned if they did and damned if they didn't. They were like, if they kept doing the same record over and over, people are going to get bored. And if they changed the formula, people are going to walk away from them. So they had just, I think, run out of time. And a lot of the newer bands that were getting signed at the end of the 80s were really already sort of imitations of something that had happened only like 5 years earlier. So you've got bands imitating Motley Crue or Poison from 1986 in 1990, so it had become very repetitive. But the interesting thing is that before Nirvana came in, there was like a period of coexistence, like Skid, and no one understood immediately that one music was going to replace the other. Like I saw Alice in Chains when I was in college or high school, I forget, and Extreme was opening for them, and Alice in Chains also played with Great White, and Soundgarden, I think, toured with Skid Row. And so there was a moment in time where it just seemed like, oh, here's this new kind of hard rock. It'll exist with the old kind of hard rock, and everything will just sort of like mush together. And it wasn't this either or situation. And I think though what Nirvana does, and I think also because Kurt Cobain himself as a person, I think was appalled by the glam metal. Like, I think he thought it was sexist and homophobic, and so he was really, I think, against it. At that point, I feel like listeners do feel like they kind of have to make a choice, between the old music and the new music. And for one genre to fade out of favor and another to replace it is the history of pop music, right? I mean, that's how it works. Ask Elvis about when the Beatles came, or but at the same time, what happened to these bands, the glam metal bands, after grunge came in, is something that we've not seen before. I mean, in like modern like a word that everybody uses now, they were kind of canceled. Like these bands from the 80s after 1993, like they could not get arrested. And it wasn't just the bands, like all of the producers, like Bo Hill, Tom Werman, those guys who we all interviewed for the book as well, like they couldn't get any jobs. Michael Wagner, they couldn't get jobs anymore. The A&R guys like got fired because bands didn't want to sign with them because they had already signed hair metal bands. Like it went all the way through. It was this house cleaning all the way through the industry. The bands themselves, like who had been playing arenas, suddenly they're playing half empty clubs. And musicians, there's a story in the book, and he's one of the great interviews in the book, and just this totally awesome dude, Brian Forsyth, who's one of the guitar players from Kix, who had, they weren't the biggest band, but they had a platinum record and a #9 single. So like they were no joke, in 1993, he's in LA and he goes to audition for the Wallflowers, Jacob Dylan's band, which is a gig he could totally do. Because he's a great guitar player. And he goes into this audition and he doesn't even mention that he was in Kix because he knows that would be a deal breaker, because nobody would want a guy from a hair metal band in their band. So people are actually like hiding their identities in the 90s. It was a complete, it was just insane. So, and I think that's really the most unique part of what happened here, is just that all of the people involved with this music were suddenly untouchable.
Mm-hmm. So I want to know from your perspective, and I'm going to keep it down to two bands, because obviously most of these bands partied like heck. And
yeah,
I want to know, between interviews that you've done in this book, who was the roughest band? Was it Motley Crue or was it Guns N' Roses?
I mean, they're both. I mean, you pick the two that are really in contention there,
Right.
They're both pretty rough. In terms, not just, they're the two bands in the book where really hard drugs come up.
Yeah.
It doesn't, like, there's one or two other ones, but like heroin is really not a thing throughout this book. Like if you were doing a book on grunge bands, you'd probably be dealing with it a lot, but it's really not a thing in this book, except where Motley Crue and Guns N' Roses come out. So those, and they were both the bands that sort of were, I feel like, real, like outsiders, like actual badass dudes, and I don't know which one is more badass. I think that, like, in terms of partying, they probably rivaled each other. Motley Crue's, because Nikki Sixx died overdosed a couple times. He's sort of taken the mantle and sort of become like the poster boy for like really but Izzy Stradlin had troubles with it. Slash had troubles with it. I think he was with Nikki Sixx one of the nights something bad happened. And then there was just like a tremendous amount of drinking. I think that from like what we got in our research, I think in the beginning, Motley Crue was a much more probably fun band. Like Doc Mcgee, their manager, told me, he's like, look, I had, our road manager out there, and I told him, like, if you have to punch these guys to get them to settle down, like, do it, because they were just, especially on that famous Ozzy tour in 1983, where like they snorted the ants and all that stuff. They were only working 40. Yeah, they were only working 45 minutes a day. You know what I mean? They're on stage 45 minutes a day, and then the other 23 hours and 15 minutes, like they were just going wild, and they were so young. So I think that they weren't maybe as dark of a vibe as Guns N' Roses was. The other thing about Motley Crue, and I'm not giving you an answer, I'm just giving you things to put in each column here,
Yeah.
By all accounts, Motley Crue, even though like these guys were just like drinking and partying all the time, were incredibly hard workers. Like if they had to be at a radio station at 7 a.m. somewhere to sell some tickets or to promote a record, they would be there. They didn't blow stuff off. They were very, very oddly professional and dedicated in their work ethic. I think that Guns N' Roses was never like that. I mean, Guns N' Roses barely got their first record done. I think Guns N' Roses is a much more complicated group of personalities.
Yeah,
and I think that's what has always made them.
Yeah, it's. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but like you said, they barely got their first record.
You should always.
And Slash, I remember in Slash's book, he had mentioned that when they started, they were a band that dabbled in drugs and were heavy into music. And then the time they became these big stars, they were dabbling in music and these heavy drug stars. It's
that's
rough.
Totally, yeah. And again, and I think that they are also, look, I mean, Axl Rose, he's another person we didn't get for the book, and we knew we wouldn't because he just doesn't do
absolutely,
interviews.
Yeah.
But you see all the people around him describing him, and he's like, he's a very, very, very intense person, and he will kick your ass if he doesn't like you, like literally. And so I think that band was there was a lot of substance abuse, but I think it was a much more high pressure environment than Motley Crue was. I think that like when there's a big part of our book is how the final classic lineup, like as we refer to it, of Guns N' Roses comes together with people leaving, coming, guys who end up starting LA Guns, and it's really complicated and really sort of like the people who end up in Guns N' Roses, in the Guns N' Roses that we know, they're all incredibly talented, but they're also people who are either so tough themselves or like so easygoing that they can hang with Axl. I think that's a really important factor for membership in Guns N' Roses, is that you can hang with Axl.
Yeah. And one of the wildest moments in history for me comes from, Guns N' Roses and Slash. I mean, because I don't remember what they had won an award. I think it may have been for Best Album for Appetite for Destruction. And Slash was just there. We won this fucking award and it's ours, motherfucker. And that's the reason why live TV is now, 5 seconds delayed because of Slash and Guns N' Roses. And I'm like, that is one of the craziest history stories for me, because it's like,
I didn't know that. That's awesome.
The only reason I know it is because it's fresh in my mind from Slash. Slash was like, we won this award, and I was up there dropping all these F-bombs. He was totally out of his mind, whacked out. And he was like, now that's why there's a 5 second delay in any live show in the world. And I was like, that's how you know you're a badass and you don't care about what you say. But, there was a funny story in here, and it was as we kind of wind down here, there was a funny story in the beginning of the book, maybe within the first couple of chapters, and it was Dee Snider from Twisted Sister. And you kind of realized that when they were on stage, jokingly, if they saw you in the front row and you were not rocking out, they were going to call you out and make you look like the biggest dick in the planet.
I love that. I love that Dee Snider. And it's funny, we did a podcast that he was on, and he talked about this. But he would do that. Like they were, if you were and this is when Twisted Sister was still a cover band, but a cover band that could bring in 5,000 people a night. They were like the biggest cover band in the New York area. They had, they're working like 4 hours a night, and he admits, like, he was like, I was out of my mind. Like, I just wanted, like, I could not tolerate the thought that somebody was not like giving me the energy that I needed to be up there. And when it was funny, he talks about the reason we found out about him yelling at people is I was interviewing Vito Bratta from White Lion, who's like one of the great guitar players of the era. And Vito was like, oh yeah, I saw Twisted Sister a bunch of times. And one night I was standing in the front and I was actually just checking out the amps and all of the gear. And I was standing there with my arms crossed, and Dee Snider picked me out. He became the guy that Dee Snider picked out. It was like a whole part. It was a whole part of the set, actually. Like the light guys knew to like put the lights on this guy in the front row, and Dee just tore Vito a new asshole. He was like, what the fuck is your problem standing here? Like, and then he's like, and he would tell the whole audience to like start booing the person. So it was a real like mass humiliation ritual that he would. And Vito to this day remembers that, and he he also credits Dee Snider from after the show telling him like, you got to get in a cover band if you want to know. That's how Vito Bratta ends up ultimately forming White Lion. But yeah, like Twisted Sister became the MTV Sister, and doing 10 years of playing covers. And it was, one of the things because you realize that for them, it wasn't really that easy decision to keep following the dream of becoming an original band, like with a record deal, because adjusting for inflation, they're each making like hundreds of thousands of dollars a year playing covers, which was very unique in the East Coast. So yeah, and like Dee Snider, it's very open now that he was completely out of his mind when he was a young man. He'll say that he still is, but like I don't think he created any less than total devotion for the audience.
Who was the one person, if you want to say, you don't have to, that was the hardest person to interview? Not because they were hard to get, but they're just so set in their ways that they're like, you know what, I just want to do this and get it over with. Because there are a lot of people like that, let's be honest, that was in the rock world. Were there any like that you interviewed?
We were really, going back to your first question about how hard it was to get people, by the time we got people to do the interviews, everybody was pretty cool. There's definitely people who are like, nobody came, I didn't get anybody on the phone and feel like they didn't want to be there.
Okay.
Even it took me 18 months to get Sebastian Bach on the phone. And when he finally did, I think for like the first 5 minutes, he was like, all right, let's get this over with. And then once they realized that we really knew what we were talking about and we loved the music, they were okay. Some people were more or less crazy than others. And to sort of flip your story on its head, some people are just particularly amazing interviews, like where they're just both funny and candid and like he just passed, but Jeff LeBar from Cinderella, like the guitar player from Cinderella, he like every 3 lines he was saying something, every 3 minutes he's saying something hilarious. So there are people that you're interviewing them and you're like, I see you scribbling right now, and you're like, but you're just like, that was gold, that was gold, that was gold, that was gold. And there were some people like that, like Ricky Rocket of Poison, where they're being really factual and very honest, but also very humorous and just dropping like you were talking about the sort of like how each of our chapters in the book opens with a quote.
Yeah.
There's some people you interview and they'll give you like 20 of those in an hour where you're just like, like, and So those are the ones I really remember. I mean, no one was really it was actually amazing because look, I've done a lot of interviews as a music journalist in my life, and I've definitely had rough interviews. I think because people were not talking to us to specifically promote something. So they weren't like in the middle of this giant press day where they were actually pretty cool. And then just some of them were amazing. You know,
and they weren't going and the funniest interviews for me when they're on, like, let's say if they got a new book coming out and they're like, yeah, I talk about it in this book, which is out August 15th of 2021. Go get it.
Yeah.
You know, I find those so funny because it's like, hey, plug away. But for this type of stuff that you were doing, you know, you're talking on the phone, you were doing Zoom, I'm pretty sure you were meeting some in person. It was just, hey, let's chill, two fans of rock, and let's just chat about rock. Let's talk about my life. Let's talk about other people's lives in music and how it propelled the world into what it is today. And I think that's what you do in this book. You don't just come in and you're just like, okay, who pissed you off this time and why? It wasn't an attack book. It was like, look, we really want to know the true stories of all of these bands and all of the music and what really happened. And so I think that's why you got a lot of great interviews and a lot of great information because of how you and Richard were doing the book.
I think so, and I thank you. And I think that you know, we were asking most people when we had the time, we would ask them about their whole career, like, or at least up through 91. Like that's basically, you know, so a lot of what we're asking people about is stuff that they don't have to talk about all the time. That's the thing. It's like when you're talking to somebody in Warrant, like if you lead like with like, so why is, do you think that the cherry pie video is stupid? Like they're gonna be like, they'll give you an answer, but they're gonna inside in their soul, they're already shutting down. You know what I mean? Like they're just like, all right, let me get this over with. It's going to be the same 5 questions I've gotten for the last 35 years. Like, let me just fucking get this over with. But we're actually going to these people and being like, so how did you start the band? What bands did you like? What was like? And like, we're going through their whole life with them. And so I think both they're getting to talk about stuff that they're not usually getting to talk about, but they're also getting to like realize like, oh, this person actually cares about like me as a musician and my art and my like the struggle and the work I put in, and not just like these 3 bullet points from Wikipedia.
Right. And you know, I don't want to turn it to me, but that's kind of how I do the show. I'm like, I don't want to know how, you know, this album came about because I can easily look up how this album came about. And I know you talked about it to 15 different people in the last 45 days, you know, and it's like, I want to know the stuff that nobody is ever going to know unless you talk to them about it. And so it's crazy because you do see a lot of people shut down. You do see a lot of people say, yeah, this song happened this way and we wrote it this way. But once you just kind of come in, then that will just come organically. Did you find that as well? Like if you just talk about it and then you say, you know, you're talking for Warrant, for example, you're talking about their life going in and out of, you know, music and who their heroes were. Cherry Pie is obviously going to come up, but they're going to be more organically into answering the questions instead of, okay, first question is Cherry Pie. How do you feel people think that song's stupid? Yeah. You know what I mean? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I think, yeah, totally. And I think that that's also just because we were trying to tell, like, I mean, with the band, there's about 10 bands that we tell their whole story. Mm-hmm. And so for those guys, I mean, like also I was doing long interviews. I mean, with some of the guys in Warrant, I think I went like 2 sessions, like 2 full hours, or, you know, because like I needed to get the whole beginning of the story when they're in Ohio and then Florida and then moving to LA and how Warrant actually was already a band. Like it's a very complicated story and I need to get all these people. And again, these are not the kind of interviews these guys do all the time. So I think they enjoy it and to not be getting these like 5 same questions. It's also kind of stressful because you got to be entertaining enough to the person you're interviewing them to keep them on the phone. Cause like I would like look at these lists of questions and I'd be like looking at the clock and I'd be like, holy shit, we're like 27 minutes into this interview. And I still haven't gotten to the part where they moved to LA yet. And you're like, oh, fuck, am I going to get to the end of it? You know, and are they going to get back on the phone with me? And you're like, you know, you do the same thing when you're doing your podcast. You're like thinking like, did I get this done? Did I get this done? I got to move them along and tell them to shut the fuck up and get to this next thing, so your brain is going a million miles an hour, even if you're trying to act chill.
Yeah. And so, man, got a couple more questions for you if you're cool with that. So the first one I want to know is, you've done 200 interviews, there's 200 people in the book, but what is one interview that stands out where you're like, that is going to be my favorite interview probably I've done my whole life?
I mean, for me, and it's kind of a nerdy thing, it was Vito Bratta from White Lion, because he was, when I was growing up, and I grew up in the 80s, he was one of my 3 favorite guitar players, like, of all time. And he does not do interviews. I think he started doing them more now that he saw the book come out and that, like, it did well and people are really, like, sort of enjoying it. But when I interviewed him, which was probably 2018 or 17, he had done 1 interview in the 20 years before that. So, like, there was nothing out there on him, and I was just like, I gotta get him. Like, I've said, and it's true, like, maybe the book was just an excuse to talk to him. And he was just so funny and cool. And, like, we spent the first 10 minutes of the interview. He lives on Staten Island, and it was, like, near Easter, and he was talking, like, he just spent 10 minutes, like, talking about, like, how he had to cook for everybody and what a pain in the ass cleaning the stuff up. Like, and it was just like, I'm broing down with my favorite guitar player, like a dude that I've spent 1 million hours trying to learn his stuff and failing. And his perspective on the end of the era was just so good too, and really touching, because he's one of the people, like, he never started another band after White Lion broke up. Like, the grunge thing and people and the world deciding that the kind of music that he had put his heart and soul into was, like, dumb and sucked. That broke him mentally. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And, like, it broke a bunch of people, but, like, that dude was, like, one of the best guitar players. And anyone you ask from that era will agree. And he just, like, the rejection of glam metal by everyone, like, it sapped his will to live. Like, he never did another record. He never even guested on another person's record. So for me, that was like talking to a ghost. So that was a really, to me, I know that he's not, like, the most famous person in the book, but to me, that was, like, just amazing. And then the other one, and it was not a musician, was Doc Mcgee, who's the manager of, he managed Motley Crue, and he managed Kiss now, and he managed Bon Jovi, and he's the guy who went to jail, for smuggling marijuana, like in the 80s, and, like, so he's like a badass. And when you get on the phone with him, he sounds exactly like Tony Soprano. Like, he's like, hey, yeah, and so, like, you're talking to this guy, and he's really funny and stuff, but you're, like, kind of like, not that I actually felt like I was in, but you're just like, because you got to push him a little bit. Like, I do not want to piss this guy off.
Yeah.
Like, if I do not want to see what happened when the switch flips, and, like, this guy is like sending people after me or whatever. And he was just so funny, talking about telling his road managers, like I said, to, like, beat up Motley Crue when he had to, and explaining how Bon Jovi was successful, and so, like, foul-mouthed and just, like, intelligent, that he was another amazing person. A lot of the people really that we got the best interviews from for the book were not the musicians. It's the managers and the producers and the people at the labels, because they kind of have a completely different perspective on it.
If you could have, and this is going to be the final question for you, if you could have 3 people, and I'll go first if you want to have time to think, but who are 3 people that you would love to sit down with and just chat? Not writing a book, not doing any type of interview. You just want to sit down with these 3 people and chat. For me, it would be probably Paul Stanley. I think he's one of the greatest of all time, in my opinion. I would say Steven Tyler, but his mind is so effed over that he probably wouldn't remember most of the stuff I wanted to ask him anyways. So I'd probably leave him out if I was going to. I'd put Dwayne Johnson in there, and then I would also put I'd probably put Paul McCartney, because I would want to know about the Beatles. I would want to know about the rise of the Beatles in America. I would want to know all that from perspective.
Have you watched that new documentary with Rick Rubin?
Is it out yet?
Where they're going through all the songs? It's out. It's out. It's on Hulu. You got to watch it, dude.
I didn't know it was
amazing.
out. I didn't know it was out yet because I knew they were working on it, and it was taking like, okay, shit, I'm gonna go. I got another podcast. I got another podcast of this, but I'm gonna watch it probably tonight. I didn't realize it was out because I knew they were working on it for like 4 or 5 years. Somebody got it, and then they scrapped it, and then somebody put it.
This is not the Peter. This is not the Peter Jackson Let It Be stuff. But this is, there's this thing on Hulu, and it's Rick Rubin who produced like all the Beastie Boys and all that stuff, and interviewing Paul McCartney, and they're pulling up individual tracks from the songs. You got to see it. It's mind blowing. Do it. Yeah,
I will.
So if you don't have Hulu, subscribe and then cancel
I've got Hulu.
But for me, the 3 people, because we did not actually interview him for the book because he does not do interviews anymore, because he thinks that everybody's going to make fun of him. But he was one of my heroes growing up. I would like to hang out for an hour with CC DeVille of Poison because he is like my spirit animal.
Yep.
And these are going to be weird answers because I actually have in my career as a journalist interviewed almost everybody that I ever wanted to.
Okay.
So which is a dick thing to say, but it's true. So
that's fine.
So this is kind of some outliers. Steve Jones, the guitar player from the Sex Pistols, who has the best radio show ever and is just hilarious and one of my guitar heroes. I would love to, and he's so fucking funny. And he also rides motorcycles, which I do. So like my real dream with him is to go ride motorcycles with Steve Jones. Who else would I want to? Like those 2, definitely. And you know who else? Because I grew up such a fan and I've never interviewed him and I've heard he's actually the coolest dude is, and this is going to be completely weird given the topic we're discussing, but Peter Buck from REM. Because I loved early REM when I was in high school. And I know a bunch of people who know him and everybody's just like, he's the coolest, most normal guy. And he says, you would love him. And I'm just like, oh wow. And and so I wouldn't want to interview him because I think he's probably a guy who's heard the same questions all over, over and over and over. But I would love to like hang out with him, like just like meet him like at a barbecue.
Sure. That's like me. Like Aerosmith is my favorite band of all time, and I have one specific question that I would love to ask Steven Tyler because I know for a fact he has never been asked this question, and I'm never going to say it on air because it's just like somebody's going to take that shit and it's going to ruin me. But it's just like, but could you ask that because it's like you said, he's all messed up. And when I've seen interviews with him and he's always like, has this person with him. He's like, what's this guy talking about? It's like, well,
he's got a mind of it. I remember, I think it was when 9 Lives was coming out, which was that like 2001 or 2002 or something, 2000?
Right.
When that record was coming out.
Right.
It had like Taste of India and stuff like that. I flew to Boston. They were finishing the record and I flew to Boston. It was for Revolver or Guitar World, I forget. And I went to Joe Perry's house and I was interviewing Joe, but Steven Tyler was there too because they were mixing. And I remember walking, there was like this barn on Joe's property that was like up the hill. And this was right when Radiohead had followed up OK Computer with Kid A, which was like this really weird synthesizer record. And I'm walking down this hill with Steven Tyler and he goes, hey man, what do you think of that new Radiohead album? And I'm like, that's a weird question to get from Steven Tyler. And I'm like, I think it's pretty good. I like the old one better. I thought the songs were better, but I think it's interesting like they're trying to do. And he just goes, I think they do one more record like that. And as far as I remember, I could be making this up. I'm pretty sure he like snapped his hand and did like a pirouette. He goes, one more record like that, they're out of here. and that was his pronouncement on Radiohead. Obviously, he was not correct, But that was my one. I never interviewed Steven Tyler, but I got to walk down a hill with him and have that conversation. And he definitely is a guy like David Lee Roth. I feel like probably where you can ask him any question you want, but he may not answer the question that you asked.
Sure.
You know,
That's
he's gonna answer whatever he's thinking about.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Tom, man, I appreciate you coming on. You guys have to read Nothing But a Good Time if you're a music nerd like myself and like Tom and like Richard Beanstalk. It's absolutely mind-blowing. It's crazy. Even the audio book is very fascinating because they got a female and they got a male, but it's absolutely phenomenal, man. And like I said, I'm not just saying it because you're on here. It's crazy, but it's a crazy great story.
I really appreciate you having us on. I'm so glad you enjoyed the book. Yeah, it's nice to work on something for 4 years and have people like it. It's a much better outcome than the other way around.
Yeah, man. So I want to we're still recording, but all this left is going to be edited out because I live by ABR, always be recording. But just got a quick question for you, and if not, it's cool. And I could also pay whatever you wanted me to. But is there any way you could sign a book to the podcast and kind of send it over, and I'll pay for shipping in the book or whatever?
Totally. Yeah, totally. You don't even need to pay for shipping in the book. Do you have my email?
I don't have your personal.
Because you emailed me, right?
No, I was it Melissa? Is that her name?
Oh, Catherine?
Catherine. Yes, that's who I emailed. I don't have your personal. No, I don't.
All right, mine is T Beaujour, so T and then my last name.
B-E-A.
At Gmail. BEAU JOUR.
Right.
At Gmail. Just shoot me your address.
Cool, man. I mean, if you, I'll shoot you over a Venmo or PayPal if I have to. But I would really love to.
No, don't worry about it.
To get it signed to the podcast, and I have a couple of like Jim Cornette, a big wrestling fan, sent me over his book and signed it, and I would love to place it on the wall. So
awesome. I will send one out in the next couple of days. Just shoot me your address and I'll do that.
Absolutely.
So it's to Hodgepodge, not to you. Okay.
Well, I will put what to put it on if you would, just to
okay. Awesome.
Tom, I appreciate.
You want it on the cover or in the? Do you want it signed on the cover or on the inside?
Whatever you want to do.
I usually do the inside.
That's fine. Do it on the inside, and I'll just I'll take it and get it printed out and frame it.
Oh, would you rather get the cover? I'll do whatever you want, dude.
I don't care, man. It doesn't.
I want to make you happy. Okay.
It's fine. It doesn't matter. It doesn't. Whatever makes you comfortable. Okay. Whatever's faster for you. Honestly.
All right. Cool.
Dude.
But just send me your address and I'll totally do that.
Absolutely, and I appreciate you so much doing this. For a small stupid podcast like myself, it was incredible getting to talk to you, and I hope I made you comfortable on here, and I hope we hit all the
absolutely
points.
You're really you're wise beyond your years, young man. You're good interviewer.
I appreciate that. Once you get a new book out or when you got a new project coming out, I'd love to get you back on. I'll get with Catherine and we'll set something up.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Tom. You have a good day.
Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Cool.
You too.
All right. Bye.